director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten longstanding principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. IFA is backing Sines versus Kessler, the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. The trial is scheduled for October 2020, and I know Amy will share a couple of emails that were sent out the last 2 days. There's some good news with regards to what's going on. Amy joined IFA with well over a decade of experience in government, politics, and advocacy. She previously served as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. Among some of Amy's many honors, a New Leaders Council faculty member, 2017 Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, 2008 Dutko Fellow for Policy and Public Service. In 2013, Amy was named a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star. And my sister-in-law would be very happy to hear this. She is a graduate of Tufts University. I'll always remember going to Steve's. That's the important thing. And it's my real pleasure and honor to introduce Amy Spitalnick.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. As you've probably figured out, I am a Long Island girl originally. And so it would have been a lot better to get to be there in person with all of you. And hopefully we could do that in the future, but this is certainly the next best thing. So I want to be mindful of the fact that I'm talking at you on a screen and keep this as sort of conversational to the extent that this platform allows. And so I know that there are a number of questions folks might have. And I know that Alan and Doug and the congregation sent over some questions as well that they've heard from folks as this came together. So I'm going to give you an overview of Integrity First for America and our Charlottesville case and sort of the state of white supremacy and extremism and anti-Semitism in America right now, and then pick from some of the questions that were already sent over in advance. And as Alan said, please feel free to send questions in the chat, which should hopefully be available to you on the bottom of your screen and pop up on the right-hand side, and I'll be able to see those in real time and can incorporate them in the conversation. So I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and like so many who grew up with that as part of their family experience, it really informs so much of my values and how I look at the world. But I think if you had told me 10, 5, even a few years ago that my career would focus around the idea of suing modern day neo-Nazis, I probably would have laughed in your face and thought that was crazy. How could something like that be necessary? How could something like that happen in America, which is the country my grandparents came to when they finally escaped Europe after the war and looked for a better life. But sadly, that is the reality in America right now. If you look at the statistics, and certainly if you think anecdotally about what we've experienced over the last few years, it's stunning. In 2018, we know that right-wing extremists killed more people than any year since 1995, which was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. That was we actually just marked the 25th anniversary of that white supremacist attack. We know that anti-Semitic incidents across the board are up 99% over the last 3 years. And in fact, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, just released their newest statistics for 2019, which showed record numbers in 2019, the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record since they started counting decades ago. And of course, we all know anecdotally what that turns into, how these stats play out on the ground, from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, to Christchurch, to Poway, to El Paso. There has been a cycle of anti-Semitic and white supremacist violence that we see over and over again, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And I think for many of us, it's impossible to look at this cycle of violence without seeing Charlottesville and what happened there 2.5 years ago as a flashpoint in the rise of this anti-Semitic extremism. And while it certainly wasn't the only incident or an isolated incident by any means, it really was the rallying cry and the flashpoint that spurred a much larger cycle. So it's worth stepping back and remembering what happened 2.5 years ago. It's easy to forget that not that long ago, neo-Nazis invaded an American city. So first, as you might remember, on the night of August 11th, 2017, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on the University of Virginia. They carried tiki torches, which were meant to be evocative of the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan. They chanted things like "Jews will not replace us" and "Blood and Soil," which is a historic Nazi slogan. They eventually surrounded a group of peaceful counter-protesters who were at the Thomas Jefferson statue, and they started throwing fuel, lit torches, beating them up. They also eventually made their way towards an interfaith gathering that was happening a few blocks away. And that gathering, which included a broad coalition of interfaith community members from the Charlottesville area, had to shelter in place because it was too unsafe to leave. A number of our plaintiffs, including one African-American man, said he thought he was going to die that night. The following day, sadly, the violence only continued. Instead of descending on the University of Virginia, instead they marched into downtown Charlottesville, where they surrounded what is now called Emancipation Park, where the Robert E. Lee Confederate Monument stands. And they first came to Charlottesville supposedly under the guise of protesting the removal of a Confederate monument, but as I'll share in a second, that is not actually what they were there to do. But they descended on downtown Charlottesville. First, they surrounded the local synagogue. It was a Saturday, so the synagogue was celebrating Shabbat. They had already moved the time of services in hopes of avoiding the neo-Nazi march. Sadly, these extremists surrounded the synagogue. The synagogue had to be evacuated out the back with Torahs. The Nazis stood outside with semi-automatic weapons, chanting things like Sieg Heil, talking online on their chats about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And the detail that really sticks with me most is that the synagogue was home to a Holocaust scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And again, decades later, in America, it was yet again under Nazi threat. And every time I read that in our lawsuit, every time I tell that story, it gets me no matter how many times I do it. It is stunning to me that something like that can happen here in America, in a place, again, that was really supposed to be a refuge for people of all backgrounds. And then, of course, the violence continued. They marched throughout downtown Charlottesville, charging a line of interfaith clergy, including Reverend Seth Wispaway, who's one of our plaintiffs. And ultimately, the day culminated, as many of us know, with an attack in which James Fields drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring many others, including a number of our plaintiffs. I'm sure many of you remember the iconic Pulitzer-winning photo, and I could try to share my screen, but it might get a little complicated. Many of you remember that photo of the car going through the crowd. And in that photo, you can see a number of our plaintiffs, including Marcus Martin, the African-American man who sort of sprawled across the back of the car rather. He had just pushed his then fiance, now wife, out of the way. On the front, you see our plaintiff Thomas Baker flipping over the hood. Natalie Romero, another plaintiff, had her skull fractured, and there's another photo that I believe won awards in which she's sitting on the curb with blood dripping down her face. It's too gruesome for us to typically show at events. But needless to say, this attack and the subsequent and the rather other violence that happened throughout the weekend was horrific. And some might think that this violence was spontaneous, that it just sort of broke out during these clashes between the Nazis and these counter-protesters. But what's important to understand is that none of this was an accident. For months in advance on social media, mainly on a platform called Discord, which is typically used by video gamers, including by many, I imagine, middle school and high school kids in our communities, these neo-Nazis and white supremacists planned every last detail of what went down in Charlottesville. They talked about the mundane and the banal. So what to bring for lunch? Would mayonnaise spoil in the sun? What's the best way to sew a swastika onto a flag? And of course, they talked about the evil. So how can they use their supposed free speech tools like signs to then wreak havoc and hurt people? How can they crack commie skulls, as they said? And they even talked about whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is of course exactly what they went on to do. None of this was an accident. It was part of this long-planned conspiracy to bring racist violence to the streets of Charlottesville. And so on behalf of 10 individuals who were injured in that violence, my organization, Integrity First for America, is suing the 24 individuals and groups who orchestrated and executed that violence. We're using a number of civil rights statutes to do this. The one that is always most of interest to folks is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This was a civil rights law first passed in the aftermath of the Civil War by the Reconstructionist Congress. It was passed to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence in the South, where you had these Klansmen running rampant, terrorizing African Americans in an attempt to block them from utilizing their recently won 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. It's been used a number of times since to protect victims of hate crimes. It's one of the few statutes that exists that give private citizens a right of recourse against other private citizens. Most civil rights laws in our country deal with government actions, the government's responsibility to protect our citizens. The KKK Act of 1871 is one that deals with private actions and provides one of the few measures of private recourse here. And so using that civil rights statute and a number of other state and federal laws, we are taking the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for what happened to court. This is not a speech case. This is not an incitement case. This is a conspiracy case. It's a case about actions. And much like if this group of us, using Zoom or any other platform, talked about robbing a bank and then went and did it, it would not be protected speech. Neither is their speech on Discord and the other social media platforms in which they talked about committing this violence and then they went and did it. We're very proud of how successful the case has been, and as Alan mentioned, it's been a particularly successful week, so we are having this conversation at a particularly useful moment. Every opportunity the neo-Nazis have taken to try to block this suit, which has been every possible one you could imagine, we've been able to beat those efforts back. So first, they tried to file what was called a motion to dismiss the case. The court swiftly rejected that in July of 2018. And the decision is on our website. I would encourage you all to read it. It's short. It's short for a court decision, maybe not short by normal standards. And it really dives into what we've been discussing, how, for example, the First Amendment does not protect the right to commit violence, or the Second Amendment does not protect what they did. And we've gone back to the court a number of times since to hold the defendants accountable to their discovery obligations, to ensure that they hand over the evidence that they're required to do by turning over their phones, computers, social media, and email accounts, and other evidence. As you might imagine, neo-Nazis are not so cooperative when it comes to a lawsuit like this. One of our lawyers likes to compare them to evil 12-year-olds, and that is certainly how they tend to behave. And so they have very flagrantly flouted these court orders over and over again, and our team is not going to let that happen. We are insistent on holding them accountable to their obligations in this case, and to ensuring that when we go to trial this fall, and we are going to trial this fall, we have every bit of evidence that we're entitled to. And so we have already won a number of sanctions against these defendants starting last year. One was actually thrown in jail in January for contempt of court after flagrantly violating a number of these court orders, and having a defendant in a civil lawsuit like ours thrown in jail is pretty unique. And actually just yesterday, we won what I think is one of the most momentous decisions in this case thus far, which was over $41,000 in sanctions against 3 key defendants. One neo-Nazi group called Vanguard America, which is the group that James Fields, who drove the car, wore the uniform of, and 2 individuals named Matthew Heimbach and Elliot Klein. We also won another decision today in which Jeff Scoop, who's another neo-Nazi leader, the former commander of a neo-Nazi group called National Socialist Movement, was ordered to turn over everything in his possession, including an undisclosed phone that he had hid from us, immediately. He has to mail that to a third-party vendor to scrape the evidence off of by Monday of next week. And so over and over again, our legal team has been able to hold these neo-Nazis accountable to their obligations, and when they fail to cooperate, win major sanctions, including these financial penalties, and in some cases, jail time. And so before I move to some of the questions that I received from Alan and Doug, and any questions folks here might have, I think it's important to understand why this case is so important and how it fits into the broader landscape of the rise of extremism and anti-Semitism in America. This case is certainly important because our plaintiffs who were grievously harmed during this violence deserve justice. It's important because there's been so little accountability for those responsible for this violence. There have been a few individual prosecutions, but the broad leadership responsible for planning and executing the violence in Charlottesville have not been held accountable in any way. And that's certainly why this case is important. But it's also important because it really is the only legal effort right now to go after the broader leadership of this violent movement. And through these financial penalties we've already won and the massive civil judgments we expect to win at trial this fall, we can bankrupt and dismantle these individuals and groups with ripple effects that will go well beyond Charlottesville and have national and potentially even global implications. And why do I say this? I'm not just sort of blustering here. What's important to know here is that the defendants in our suit really are at the larger of this, or rather at the center of this much larger white supremacist movement. So, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue on Shabbat a year and a half ago at Tree of Life congregation communicated on a right-wing chat site called Gab with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque in New Zealand about a year ago painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag, which was first popularized by one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach. And of course, we know how Christchurch has inspired the Poway shooting, where a white supremacist opened fire during Shabbat services at a synagogue in California last year, and the El Paso shooting, in which another white supremacist opened fire at an El Paso Walmart that was frequented by Latinos. He specifically drove 10 hours out of his way to target that Walmart. And on we see the cycle go. Even now during coronavirus, as we see extremists and anti-Semites try to co-opt this pandemic to spread their hate, we are seeing the central role of our defendants. So some of you may have seen reports. Of course, there are white supremacists who have been trying to blame the Jews for coronavirus. Much like with anything bad that happens in the world, they say that we are responsible for the virus, that it is part of a broader plot to increase Jewish influence and power. There have also been anti-Asian, anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, a horrific rise in anti-Asian attacks that many of you have seen, so much of which has been fueled on these white supremacist chats and other social media. But very quickly, those conspiracy theories have also turned into real world action. First, we had white supremacists talk about trying to turn the virus into a bioweapon they would target at Jews and law enforcement. Then we learned of a white supremacist who was actually a member of one of our defendants, National Socialist Movement, who tried to blow up a hospital in Missouri treating coronavirus patients. And a few weeks after that, we learned of another white supremacist who tried to burn down a Jewish assisted living facility in Western Massachusetts. At the same time, we've seen these protests, these anti-lockdown protests that some of you might have seen in the news, where you have these extremists literally carrying Nazi slogans. One carried the Auschwitz slogan on a sign, trying to compare what people are experiencing right now with their inability to get haircuts and go out to eat to what we as Jews experienced during the Holocaust. And some have been carrying blatantly anti-Semitic signs, including ones that said Jews are, quote, the real virus, with a rat that was wearing a Star of David and a kippah. Of course, the anti-Semite who was carrying that sign, as it turns out, according to the ADL, is also a member of National Socialist Movement, one of our defendants, and attended an NSM event with the would-be hospital bomber from Missouri a year before. So over and over again, we see how the defendants we're taking on in this suit are central to this broader white supremacist movement and this continued cycle of violence and extremism and anti-Semitism in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. So our theory of change is quite simple. By going after the leaders and the groups that are at the center of this movement, by winning large financial penalties and judgments against them through this case, we can bankrupt and dismantle them and have impacts that go well beyond Charlottesville with truly national and global implications. There's so much else to say about this case, about the rise of anti-Semitism and extremism here, including some of the conspiracy theories that motivate their actions. But perhaps it might make sense for me to move to some of the questions I've received. And I should also know, and I don't know if folks have the ability to ask questions in the chat, if you don't just perhaps wave your hand or let Alan or someone know, and we can figure out a way to ensure you do. But please do feel free to ask questions there. You can also, if you're on email, you can also email the questions to contact@integrityfirstforamerica.org, and I will see them immediately and can answer them in case for some reason the chat is not working here. Perfect. And so I'm looking at some of the questions we received in advance. What type of security issues do you encounter working with neo-Nazis? As you might suspect by some of the measures we took around this event, security is the top priority and a major issue for us at IFA and for our plaintiffs and our legal team and anyone else involved in this case. Our case, we're very proud, is part of an effort that's led by 3 Jewish women. Myself and the 2 lead counsels, Roberta Kaplan and Karen Dunn, are 3 Jewish women, and we don't hide that fact. The defendants have been particularly disgusted and angry with that and have made it well known that they don't appreciate being sued by anyone, but particularly by Jewish women. And so the number of threats and attacks that we've gotten along those lines are not worth detailing here, not just because my mother is watching, but also because they are horrific and not worth anyone's time. But suffice it to say, security is a very real issue for us in this case. That means we do a few things. One, to be completely straightforward, it means the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security. The legal work itself is being done basically pro bono. The money that we raise directly funds security most of all, and then some other smaller expenses like evidence collection, scraping evidence off
That's the only way I can get on.
off of folks' devices. So it is a real challenge. It means that on a daily basis, we have a team that is looking on the dark web, on the social media sites and other places to see what these defendants and their supporters are saying about us, catching threats that we can then report to law enforcement. At least in some cases, we have been contacted by law enforcement after the fact to say they've made arrests related to some of the threats that we've gotten. And then, of course, when we have trial itself, and we will have a 4 to 5 week jury trial in Charlottesville this fall, we will need to have round-the-clock security for our legal team, our plaintiffs, and our expert witnesses to ensure that they're safe on a daily basis as they go to and from the courthouse. And so this is a rather unique case. In most civil litigation, you are not dealing with neo-Nazi defendants, and therefore you're not dealing with threats like this. So we take it seriously. We also know that the threat here is not just our own defendants' capacity for violence, which is real, and we saw firsthand in Charlottesville, but also their ability to inspire their loyal followers to action, which is what we've seen over and over again in this broader cycle of white supremacist violence. So we take it seriously. Again, everything we raise directly funds those critical needs. And we are committed to ensuring our whole team, our lawyers, our witnesses, and our plaintiffs remain safe during this process.
Amy?
Yes.
We have a question from Jim.
Great.
It says, what are you doing to combat anti-Semitism on campuses and intersectionality?
Great. So I think and feel free to let me know if I'm not answering the second half of that question correctly. So I'm glad someone brought up campuses because they are, as many of you know, truly where so much of this is happening in a variety of ways. And as I imagine people here know, is a place where anti-Semitism on both sides of the political spectrum has run rampant. It is obviously an issue that's near and dear for me. I was my campus Hillel president many years ago when I was in college. It is an issue that has only gotten worse in the years since and that we closely follow at IFA. One of the things that I think is so important about this case is that there are 3 organizations directly responsible for nearly all anti-Semitic white nationalist propaganda in the United States, and 2 of them are defendants in this lawsuit. One of them is a group called Identity Europa. They now have rebranded after our lawsuit because they didn't think our lawsuit was that good for their brand, which we agree. They now go by American Identity Movement, but that doesn't change the fact that they are accountable and liable under our suit. They are responsible for a huge chunk of anti-Semitic propaganda on college campuses. Similarly, a group, Vanguard America, one of our defendants, had an offshoot rebrand as something called Patriot Front, which again has been responsible for the vast majority of anti-Semitic and white nationalist propaganda on college campuses and more generally, including right here in New York. There were reports over the winter of this anti-Semitic and white nationalist propaganda being found in Brooklyn, including in Bay Ridge and in Park Slope, which are places that I don't think anyone would suspect they would find something like this. And so this case can have a very direct, tangible impact on that issue, on the issue of white nationalist and anti-Semitic propaganda, not just on college campuses, but more broadly, because by going after these groups, bankrupting them, and then seizing their assets, it will be a lot harder for them to spread this sort of hate. Jim also asked about intersectionality. And so I'm going to answer it the way that I'm interpreting the question, which is that I think it's so important, and this case is really one of the best means to illustrate it, the ways in which all of our fates are intertwined. And it really underscores that each of us has a responsibility to protect any other community that is under attack. And so there's an activist named Eric Ward. Some of you might have read his work. I would strongly encourage you to read it and can certainly send Alan and team the link, who speaks beautifully. He's an African-American man who runs an organization called the Western State Center, and he speaks stunningly in ways that I could never appropriately summarize about how, as an African-American man, he sees it as his responsibility to fight anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is at the core of the white nationalism that has also been responsible for so much of the violence against his community. And likewise, the racism that's at the core of white nationalism is responsible for the attacks against us as a Jewish community. And so understanding the ways in which our fate is intertwined is so important and central to our work, and it's really reflected in the diversity of plaintiffs in our case who were targeted for that diversity, for their skin color, their religion, their willingness to stand up for the rights of others. And I think few things underscore this as much as the conspiracy theory that fueled not just what happened in Charlottesville, but so many of these subsequent attacks. At the core of this ideology is anti-Semitism. And one of our lawyers, Robbie Kaplan, who represented Edie Windsor in the landmark marriage equality case at the Supreme Court, likes to talk about how, she's a famous lesbian. She won this big LGBTQ case. They could go after her for anything. She's a New York City lawyer. What they choose to go after her for is the fact that she's a Jew. And it underscores more than anything that at the core of this ideology is an anti-Semitism that has been growing for decades, and that is rooted in something called replacement theory. The idea that the replacement of the white race, what they believe is a white genocide, is being orchestrated by the Jews, that we are responsible for immigrants and refugees coming to this country, for any success the African American community has, for anything that they deem in contradiction to their vision for a white nation. And this replacement theory, we saw firsthand in Charlottesville. That's what they literally mean when they say Jews will not replace us. But we also saw it in each of these other white supremacist attacks, most notably in Pittsburgh, where the shooter targeted Tree of Life Synagogue because they work with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, in supporting refugees of all backgrounds coming to America. We saw it again in Christchurch. We saw it again in Poway. We saw it in El Paso. That same anti-Semitic replacement theory has been central to so many of these white supremacist attacks, and at its core is an anti-Semitism, and it speaks to the fact that you can't fight one form of hate without any form of hate without taking on anti-Semitism, and without us as Jews recognizing the need to also fight these other forms of hate. And so, while the word intersectionality, I think, has been ill-defined and gets a bad rap in some cases, understandably, I think in this case, and certainly in this lawsuit, it is important for all of us to understand the ways in which our fates are intertwined and our responsibility to fight all of these forms of hate, because none of us are safe if one of us is not safe.
Amy?
Yes.
Thank you for that. We do have another question from Doug. It says, do you feel the U.S. government is actively fighting this domestic terrorism?
That's a great question. It's a complicated answer because there are various factors at play here. I will say that I don't think we would be in this situation if we had a government that was actively fighting this with the resources and the energy it warrants. Unfortunately, the stats back up the fact that over the last 3.5, 4 years, we've seen a disinvestment in fighting domestic terror and extremism. So, for example, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which was created to take on extremism and hate crimes like what happened in Charlottesville, their cases and investigations are down over 2/3 since the start of the Trump administration. Similarly, this administration has cut programs like the DHS, Department of Homeland Security Domestic Terror Intelligence Unit, anti-extremism programs, including cutting just a few weeks before Charlottesville an anti-extremism program. That being said, I will say that there have been some positive developments in the last 8 or so months, particularly since the El Paso attack last August. We've seen the FBI start to give this crisis of white supremacist domestic terror the attention it warrants. They've made a number of high-profile arrests in recent months, and that's a good thing. We've also seen, just in the last few months, the State Department finally labeled one group, one white supremacist group, a foreign terror organization. This is the first time that has happened. This is a group called the Russian Imperial Movement that has deep ties to a number of domestic extremists here, including our own defendant, Matthew Heimbach. He's the same one who inspired the Christchurch shooter and who we actually won those 5-figure sanctions against just yesterday. So that's good news. The State Department took an important step in the right direction in actually labeling one of these white supremacist groups a domestic terror, rather a foreign terrorist group. That being said, we are not starting from zero here. We're starting from sort of so far below zero. There's so much that needs to be done. There is some basic legislation that has been sort of stalled in Congress for years that would provide important steps forward in closing basic gaps between different levels of government, something called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, sponsored by Senator Dick Durbin and a few others. That would require reporting between local, state, and federal government, put resources into things like rooting out white supremacy in our military, and ensure that there are sufficient resources going to tackling this issue. Similarly, there's something called the No Hate Act, which would improve hate crimes reporting and other work, because as many of you might suspect, hate crimes reporting is it's all over the place when it comes to what we know. And so it's hard to get a good sense of just how rampant anti-Semitism and other forms of hate are, particularly on the government. And we rely on groups like the Anti-Defamation League to do important work there, which is not really how I think a government should operate. And so the short answer is no, they're not doing enough. There have been positive signs in the last 8 months or so. And my hope is that this case, and when we go on trial, when we put the leaders of this violent movement on the stand in Charlottesville this fall, we lay bare the anti-Semitism, the hate, the violence at their core, the ways in which they co-opted social media to plan this violence and to then do it. It will not just, again, hold them accountable, win justice for our plaintiffs, and bankrupt these individuals and groups, but it can also spur a national conversation about the seriousness of this issue and our policymakers' responsibility and the private sector's responsibility to start to do something here.
We also have a follow-up question for Jim. It says, how important do you think the Never Again Education Act will be in fighting anti-Semitism?
So I want to make sure I know exactly the details of this act because I have not read it in some time. I do think education is critical here. And so as both the granddaughter of survivors and as someone who works on these issues now, I think we can all agree that the current education programming that exists around these issues is woefully insufficient. And you see these stats come out where, for example, most millennials and whatever the generation is below millennials don't even know what Auschwitz was. That is not acceptable. And as we are dealing with rising anti-Semitism here and other forms of rising hate, education is critical. And I know that that's a bill that's been deeply supported by a number of organizations with which we pass. I believe it's sponsored by, I want to say it's sponsored by a New York City rep, perhaps Carolyn Maloney. And so my recollection is that it is one that I would personally be very supportive of. We at IFA don't do lobbying. We are a 501c3, so we are not allowed to actually do direct lobbying. But my recollection of this bill is that it's one that seemed pretty straightforward and like a no-brainer. I wish that we didn't have to legislate some of these things. I wish we were in a place where Holocaust and general anti-hate education were just par for the course. But sadly, we seem to be moving farther and farther away from that, as the stats show. There are also some questions I have here that I can pull through. So there's one question here. Is there any benefit to having a monetary judgment against a defendant, individual, or organization without any assets? And that's a great question. Why, right? If we win millions of dollars of judgments against these Nazis, what does that ultimately mean? There's good precedent for this. We have actually seen firsthand the benefits of winning large civil judgments against these groups and these individuals, even if they can't pay it all up front. So for example, some of you might remember these cases from the 80s and 90s in which the victims of hate crimes, including the mother of the victim of a hate crime named Michael Donald, went after the KKK and other groups responsible. And in the course of that litigation, they ultimately won a number of monetary assets, including the title to the KKK's headquarters in Tuscaloosa. And what they were able to do through that litigation is effectively bankrupt and dismantle these organizations and ensure that they were put out of business. There's other cases as well, for example, a case brought by the law firm Paul Weiss in the 90s in which they went after a site called the Nuremberg Files. And that site targeted reproductive health doctors and other reproductive health professionals around the country by putting their name, their photo, their address up on the site and putting a big red X through their face when one of them was murdered or injured or attacked in some other way. By going after this group and this website, they were able to win these large judgments. And then what they did was essentially follow them around for the rest of their lives, collecting on these judgments, ensuring that any asset they received, whether it be wages, property that they owned, donations from their fellow extremist supporters, or anything else, were seized immediately. And that, again, ensures that they're able to sort of be kept out of business. It also, and perhaps more importantly, puts a very clear deterrent in place, showing that anyone who is part of these violent conspiracies will face very real financial and legal consequences and have their lives and their livelihood fully upended. And the deterrent effect in some ways is even more valuable than the assets themselves, because it shows, again, very real consequences for this behavior. And as we've seen in the last few years, the number of attacks on reproductive health facilities has dramatically decreased, at least when it comes to violent attacks. And in this case, the Nuremberg Files case played an important role in that, just as we believe our case can play an important role in creating both very real consequences for those responsible for what happened in Charlottesville and at the center of this movement, and deterring future attacks. I'm looking at some of the other questions here. I see a question about balancing the desire to suppress hate with the importance of freedom of speech. I spoke a little bit about this earlier, but I think it's worth underscoring. I don't think you will find bigger advocates for civil liberties and free speech than the lawyers working on this case, and myself and my team at IFA. But this case is not about speech. If these defendants had simply gone to Charlottesville and stood there with their heinous anti-Semitic signs and even carrying some of their guns and chanting the awful anti-Semitic and racist things that they had done, they would have had every right to do that. But that's not what they did. They planned a weekend of violence, and then they went and they executed that. They brought violence to Charlottesville as part of this long planned conspiracy. And so it's so important to understand that this is not a case about speech. This is not even a case about incitement, but it is a case about conspiracy, about actions that they took. And yes, there are words involved in a conspiracy. You have to talk in order to conspire, much like, as I mentioned, if this group had spoken about robbing a bank and then we went and did it, that would not be protected speech. And similarly, their speech in those Discord and other social media chats is not protected. And so I think, in fact, this case can actually draw a really clear line in the sand that says, while you have every right to believe and to say and shout your awful things, you don't have a right to turn it into violence. to conspire to commit violence. And we are fully confident that the jury will recognize that when we go to trial. The court has already rejected the argument that the First Amendment protects their right to do this. And in fact, some former leaders from the ACLU and other civil liberties experts have been publicly supportive of this case for this reason, because they believe it can actually draw that very important line in the sand.
We have another question,
Please.
and this one is from Nancy. It says, is there a benefit to a greater coalition between Black rights groups, for example, Black Lives Matter, and Jewish rights groups? If so, how can we work toward that?
Great question. Look, I think our fates are all intertwined, as I mentioned. And so while I imagine some people on this call might not agree with everything Black Lives Matter does in terms of their tactics, much like they might not agree with everything that we do in our capacity as advocates or whatever it might be, we all have to recognize the ways in which our fates are intertwined, and that when, a Black jogger is killed by two racists in Georgia, or Jews are gunned down in their synagogue, or Muslims and Sikhs are targeted in mosques and temples, all of our fates are at stake there. And not rooting out each of those forms of hate only jeopardize all of us. So I would say there's 100% a benefit there. We think in this case, it's been very heartening to see broad, diverse communities come together in support of this case. We've done events around the country that have seen broad coalitions that have brought together not just Jewish groups and Christian groups and Muslim and Sikh groups, but also the Black Lives Matter type racial justice organizations in those local communities that have come out in support of fighting white supremacy, using this case as an example. We certainly see it in the diversity of our plaintiffs and what they're involved in. And I think it's so important that we recognize just how intertwined our fates are, and that even if we don't agree on everything, we have an obligation to stand strong together. I would also say that this isn't just a progressive issue. This is an issue about fundamental values and who we are as a country. Do people have a right to be free in their practice of their religion, to walk on the street as African Americans, as Latinos? And that should not be something that is limited to one side of the political spectrum. There are certainly ways, and certainly ways in which politics directly influences this, and a way in which politicians have certain politicians, as you say, have particularly emboldened a number of our defendants and others in this movement. But this is something that I would hope and would expect people on both sides of the aisle can quickly recognize, because again, all of our fates are at stake here, and all of our security is at stake here. Great. Well, I see one more question here, which might be a good way to wrap things up. I see a question: what is our role? How can we support your work? There's so much to be said and so much to be done on this issue. And I think coming out to an event like this, particularly right now when there's a lot going on people's plates, and it's not easy to talk about an issue as difficult as this one at a time as difficult as this one. So being here and showing up is so important. There's a few both specific things that you can do as it relates to IFA in this case, and a number of things you can do more broadly in the fight against anti-Semitism and extremism. Specifically when it comes to IFA, go to our website, integrityfirstforamerica.org. I think we can also put it in the chat perhaps. You can sign up for case updates. You can get those alerts when we get those great decisions like the ones Alan and I mentioned earlier. Read the lawsuit itself, read some of the other decisions, including the decision I mentioned in which the judge rejected the efforts by the defendants to throw out the case and specifically talked about the First Amendment question. And sign up for case updates. There's an activist toolkit where you can find sample social media content and other information that you can use to spread the word. And you can donate. As I mentioned, every dollar that we raise directly supports this case, mainly security issues and other vital needs like evidence collection. And directly, again, goes directly to the case. The legal fees are being done, like I mentioned, largely pro bono. The money that we raise directly supports security, evidence collection, and other vital case needs. And spread the word. We are eager for people to know that this case exists. It's so easy to feel frustrated and scared and angry right now every time you read about another anti-Semitic attack, another racist attack. this is a very concrete, tangible thing that you can do to fight back against rising anti-Semitism and hate. It has the potential to have impacts that are far greater than the case itself, and then Charlottesville itself. It can have major impacts, as I mentioned, on this extremist movement, not just here in the United States, but on a global basis, really taking on and taking down those who are at the center of it. So spread the word, let people know that there is a concrete way that they can fight back. One of the things that I think is so important to recognize, so as I mentioned, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and my grandparents didn't have a justice system. They didn't have laws like the Ku Klux Klan Act and others that were created to protect them and protect their neighbors from racist violence and from anti-Semitism. We do. We live in a country that is based on the rule of law. We have a justice system, and it is meant to protect us, and we can use it to protect ourselves. It's so important that we use it to protect ourselves and ensure that it works for us. And so for me, that is one of the most heartening parts of this, that as scary as this moment might feel, we are in a moment where we can fight back, where there's something tangible we can do, where we can use the laws and the systems that we have to fight back. And even if our government won't do everything we need it to do, we have our own forms of recourse right now, and we will use them, and we will win when we put these Nazis and white supremacists before a jury this fall. So integrityfirstforamerica.org, please sign up, donate if you can, spread the word. You can reach us at contact@integrityfirstforamerica.org, or on the website, there's a contact form. If you have any questions, if you're interested in attending a future event, or more importantly, encouraging your friends and neighbors to attend a future event, we have a number of virtual programs coming up throughout the summer and into the fall, because we might not be able to have large-scale in-person events for some time, sadly. And so we are eager to continue to get out the word this way. And if you have ideas of folks we should be talking to, who we should be engaging in these events, or an idea for an event yourself, please reach out to us, let us know. So integrityfirstforamerica.org, sign up, donate, spread the word, and please let us know what we can tell you to be helpful. I don't know if there's...
And we have one more question. I believe we can end on this one. It's from Elaine. It says, how do you feel about different sectors of Jews speaking poorly about other sectors, and how it affects anti-Semitism?
So there's a lot to say on that question. I think we both have I suspect that there might be some background to that question related to perhaps some of the public health things happening right now in the Orthodox community. And look, I'm someone who worked in government for a long time and believe that it's important that public health steps be taken and that enforcement happens when they are not. But I also think that too often the Jewish community is unfairly singled out or targeted in ways that it should not be, and that fair enforcement of issues like public health are too often co-opted and exploited by extremists to spread their hate. And this is true of, frankly, anything as it relates to the Jewish community. Anything we do, anything we say is so often co-opted and exploited by these extremists. In fact, I should say I did a webinar a couple weeks ago, and within days it ended up on a white supremacist website in which they said I was part of a conspiracy to totally stifle free speech and get rid of the First Amendment. And so, as you could imagine, anything we say, anything we do is quickly turned and exploited in a way. So I think we should be mindful of how we talk about things and make sure we're talking about the substance. We're not singling out a single community, but also I think it is our responsibility to hold people accountable to their obligations, to their public health obligations. So it's a tough question. It's one that I think about quite a lot, and particularly in my time in government and the AG's office in City Hall, we thought about quite a lot, I know. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned, no matter, how, I think there are, just as in any religion, there are tensions between denominations and sects. At the end of the day, all of our fates are intertwined here, and in particular, the Orthodox community has been targeted in ways that are horrific to imagine, because they are the Jews who are most visible. They are the ones who extremists can see on the street and target, knowing 100% that they are Jewish. And that is something that we all have an obligation to keep in mind. and again underscores the ways in which our fates are intertwined, and we have an obligation to speak out against any form of hate, even if it isn't against the part of the Jewish community that we most associate with. So I hope that answered the question.
Well, we thank you very much for all of your time. Alan, would you like to take it from here?
Thank you, Damien. Thank you so much, Amy. Very, very informative, very important. And hopefully, as you said, we can get you back when it's a live event. Thank you also to Serena for all your help these last couple of weeks. She's been very helpful to me in everything we were trying to do. And really, wish you only the very best. You're doing an amazing thing, a very important job. And we will certainly help get the word out about what Integrity First for America is trying to do and accomplish. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here,
Thank
for
you.
sharing about this, and for doing whatever you can to spread the word. Please be safe, stay healthy.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be safe.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great.
Alan,
Was
I'm
everyone Dave?
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Alan, it was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
How
guys.
did you get her?
Doug and Penny saw her at Hergic.